Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Rhodes House. A warm welcome from Camilla and I to all of you. This is really a special afternoon for us, as many of you know. This is the 10th memorial lecture in honor of Bram Fischer, and of course this year also in honor of our dear friend Joel Joffe. And today we're delighted to welcome an outstanding speaker, Mr. Sipho Pityana, who I'll introduce more properly in due course. But just to give everyone a bit of a background for those of you who haven't been here before, and I see many familiar faces, over the years we've welcomed a wide variety of speakers on the Bram Fischer lecture, but a common thread in all of these has been justice in Africa. The Rhodes Trust is a global scholarship organization. It brings together exceptional people from all over the world in all fields of study with a common characteristic, and that is that they're impatient with the world as it is, and they have the courage to change it. Bram Fischer was one of those people, a person who had the courage to act. He was a Rhodes Scholar from 1931 at New College and was a South African lawyer of Afrikaner descent, notable for his anti-apartheid activism and for his legal defense of anti-apartheid figures, of course, including the Rivonia 13, of whom Nelson Mandela was one, now obscured slightly behind the portrait that we'll unveil later today. And we're very proud to have Bram as part of our legacy. Nelson Mandela said, Bram Fischer challenged his own people because he felt what they were doing was morally wrong. As an Afrikaner, his conscience forced him to be ostracized by his own people, and he showed a level of courage and sacrifice that was immeasurable. I fought against only injustice, not against my own people. A pretty remarkable quote. Brawn was sentenced to life imprisonment on the 9th of May in 1966 and remained a prisoner until his death in May of 1975 at age 67. Nelson Mandela, who was refused permission to attend the funeral, was to write subsequently, "The dictators of oppression and brutality had other unintended effects, and that's what produced the Bram Fischers of our time. Men of such extraordinary courage, wisdom, and generosity that their like may never be known again." Now it might be perhaps an opportune moment to remember also Ahmed Kathrada, one of the last 3 Rivonia survivors, and I think there's a bit of a handout at the front, who passed away just in March this year. Returning to the present day, this year's lecture is dedicated to the memory of Lord Joffe, who passed away on the 18th of June. Joel has always been the biggest supporter of the Bram Fischer Memorial Lecture since its relaunch in 2007. Despite a remarkable legal career, during which he served as an instructing solicitor on Nelson Mandela's defense team at the Rivonia trial, he was always modest and dedicated himself to promoting the legacy of Bram. And I think all of you who are here today know what a remarkable, generous, and yes, modest man he was. He'll be greatly missed. 2 other people played a fundamental role in supporting him in the memorial's establishment. And they include Alan Ryan, who was then warden of New College, and David Anderson, then at African Studies, now at Warwick. We thank them all, because without them, we certainly wouldn't be here. This afternoon's lecture will be delivered by Mr. Sipho Pityana, who's here with us today, a businessman and civil society activist. Mr. Pityana has a long history of political activism in both liberation and trade union politics. Following the end of apartheid, he was Director General in the Departments of Labor and later Foreign Affairs, and now serves as chairman of Anglo Gold Ashanti. Today he spends much of his time campaigning to promote and protect the South African Constitution, near and dear to many of your hearts, and is a convener of Save South Africa and chairperson of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. The title for this year's Bram Fischer Memorial Lecture is "Can South Africa's Constitutional Democracy Be Sustained?" And we all look forward to hearing Sipho's thoughts on this important topic. Please welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Charles, and I must start by saying that in Nguni languages, Sipho means gift, and Sipho means disease. So please take note. Charles accuses me of being Sipho, but in fact I'm Sipho. Well, distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen, firstly, let me thank the organizer of today's event for the invitation to address this significant occasion in honor of a great South African hero here at his alma mater. It is humbling to deliver the lecture for Bram Fischer, who dedicated his life in the struggle for South Africa's freedom and dignity of his fellow citizens, sacrificing his own freedom in the process. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to speak in his memory. Equally, it is an honor, indeed a great honor, to follow the footsteps of extraordinary South Africans who delivered the same address previously in his memory. And they include one of my heroes, Denis Goldberg, who, similarly a white South African, gave his back to his own community to join us in struggle. Navi Pillay, Justice Edwin Cameron, and that lion of our legal profession in South Africa, Advocate George Bizos. This occasion, as you've heard, is of course tinged with some sadness, given the passing of one of this lecture's originators, Lord Joel Joffe. Indeed, please accept my deepest condolences. Joel was an exceptional and courageous person who will forever occupy a special place in the hearts of many South Africans. There are 4 aspects to my address today. The first one is to outline how the Zuma regime turned the ANC into a political party hostile to South Africa's constitution, which truly faced its severest test under his leadership. The second part would be to assert that Jacob Zuma's catastrophic leadership, under his leadership, the ANC betrayed its historic mission. Please note that when Bram Fischer was confronted by similar circumstances, when Afrikaner imperialism, anti-imperialism, became racial chauvinism, he took the difficult step of breaking ranks with his fellow Afrikaners to become part of a liberation movement. It is he who said, and I quote, "I engaged upon these activities because I believed that in the dangerous circumstances that have been created in South Africa, it was my duty to do so," close quote. And so genuine ANC cadres today face their own Bram Fischer moment in deciding to stand up and speak against freewheeling corruption and contempt for the poor that has increasingly come to define the government and the party. Thirdly, I preemptively celebrate the anniversary of Save South Africa campaign, which was launched on the 2nd of November last year, as a culmination, by the way, of civil society's escalating collective defense of our constitutional democracy. With pride and aspiration and inspiration, I look at the principled and growing response by ordinary South Africans to increasingly dire situation in our country. I argue that ahead of ANC as a party that delivered a free South Africa, this new movement of valiant soldiers is the true custodian of our constitutional democracy, ensuring its sustainability and defending our sovereignty. My final point would be to caution against increasingly popular view, perhaps, that South Africa may have become, and I quote, just another failed post-colonial experiment. I would assert that it is not. However, I would warn that we cannot for a second be complacent, lest we are totally engulfed by these stormy seas that we're navigating. South Africa today is going through circumstances that require calm heads, skillful navigation, and steely resolve. Like Bram Fischer, we have we must have unwavering confidence and commitment to our cause, which, once again, must be to deliver our country from those forces that are seeking to destroy it. So let me spend a bit of time to share with you Zuma's ANC's affront to the Constitution. The ANC chose Jacob Zuma as its president in 2007, in full knowledge of the fact that he was a shady and unscrupulous character. After all, with a long list of corruption and racketeering charges hanging over his head and widely publicized allegations of sexual assault and rape, his moral compass was hardly a state secret. Less than 2 years later, he moved to the Union buildings and took control of the Republic. He has since manipulated both country and party to his own ends ever since. That he remains the president of the country today, despite growing catalogue of crimes which he stands accused of, is a stain on our nation's history. That the ANC, the party of Albert Luthuli, Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela, has not only failed to move decisively to remove him, but has also unscrupulously defended him, is a disgrace from which it may never recover. Few of us here would have imagined that a leader of the ANC would single-handedly sabotage the efforts to advance the development of our state, uplift our people from decades of repression under apartheid and centuries of colonial subjugation. But Jacob Zuma seems to have done exactly that. If we were to search for positives, if any, of Zuma's tenure, it might be that he has done more than anyone else to vindicate South Africa's choice of a true constitutional democracy as our preferred system of government. Anything short of that, we would already have been one of the failed states on our continent. And here is a litany of his disablement of institutions of criminal justice. Zuma, the crime suspect, had a clear set of priorities after taking office. His first order of business was to disable and to repurpose the criminal justice system in a cynical move with lethal consequences that very few saw happening until it was too late. Of course, the first casualty in that campaign was the Director for Special Operations, popularly known as the Scorpions. This is a unit that, if you like, was our own FBI, established with the assistance of our international partners to fight organized crime. It was feared by criminals and held in high esteem at home and abroad. Zuma ordered it to be disbanded and replaced with the Hawks, a poor imitation that he brought under his firm control, using a procession of ministers serving at his pleasure. At the same time, the police service made an unmistaken shift from one steeped in human rights culture of post-apartheid South Africa to an incompetent and corrupt agency that was becoming increasingly repressive and brutal. Before long, a new police force would re-emerge that demonstrated disdain and complete disregard for civil liberties. Police were urged by politicians who would come to embrace a shoot-to-kill ethos in direct conflict with our Constitution and the Bill of Rights that enshrined the right to life. Meanwhile, elements in the ANC's leadership had begun to stray away from its founding principles and began baying for the reintroduction of the death penalty to deal with violent crimes. What a betrayal. To match the militarization of the police services, the focus on our prison system regressed from a correctional system to a penal regime. The move would undoubtedly have pleased the Nationalist Party mandarins like Kobe Kutsie, who presided over the horror of our jails through the 1980s. Today, our jails are hatching grounds for gangsterism and violent criminals. It is hard to argue that these changes didn't usher in an era for contempt of human rights in our country. How else could a miners' strike turn into a massacre where dozens were killed by police bullets at Marikana in 2012? The eerie echoes with Bisho just over 20 years earlier, when apartheid proxies mowed down 28 protesters near my home in the Eastern Cape. The following year, we watched in horror at a community leader, Andries Tatane, who was murdered by police in full glare of the public. His crime, taking part in a civic protest action, an inalienable right under our Constitution. I could go on and on and on. The fact, though, is that allegations of police brutality are commonplace in our country. The apartheid regime had a name for it. It called it kragdadigheid, which roughly translated means unyielding power through force. Then, as now, this was designed to cow and to terrify. Isn't it an irony that a post-apartheid free South Africa embraces tactics of a discarded regime? There were other elements of state security apparatus to co-opt. The intelligence services was emerging as a professional outfit in a post-apartheid South Africa, yes. But their blatant politicization has put paid to that. Instead, they are increasingly an unworthy partner in the international collaborative international efforts of the intelligence community. The National Prosecution Authority, which here you call the Attorney General's office, was another prime target in this broad assault by the Zuma regime at the criminal justice system. After all, its doggedly independent leader, Advocate Vusi Pikoli, had the temerity to honor the Constitution and charge Mr. Zuma for fraud and racketeering, despite widespread calls for political expediency. Pikoli's eventual dismissal opened the path for the spate of political appointments that followed thereafter. Top-class prosecutors responded by exiting the prosecution authority in droves, leaving it a shadow of its former self. Today, South Africa's prosecution services lack credibility, public confidence, and trust. An independent judiciary, of course, was to be the next target. Zuma turned to an arcane piece of legislation under apartheid in violation of the constitution of the country, as he sought to extend the term of office of a Chief Justice. The highly respected Justice Sandile Ngcobo, barely 2 years in role, seemed ready to accept this unconstitutional favor. But, as the old saying goes, a favor done is a favor owed. And so, we saw a clear threat to the independence of the judiciary. Thankfully, Ngcobo stepped down rather than be put through the ringer of an urgent legal action that was being marshaled against the extension. Attacks, of course, against the judiciary have been unrelenting, as forces of darkness have repeatedly tried to subordinate it to the executive. They have consistently failed, thanks to the unwavering resistance by the judiciary itself and support from wider society. The authors of our Constitution had the incredible foresight to provide for independent institutions with the sole remit of safeguarding the democracy of our country. Not only do we have a separation between the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature, but Chapter 9 of our Constitution gives us the tools to ensure protection of civil liberties, media freedoms, along with transparency and accountability. Zuma, of course, and his cronies have moved on them too, part of the gambit of shutting down the democratic space. The organizations in question would include Public Protector, the Human Rights Commission, the Auditor General, the Independent Electoral Commission, among others. The somewhat cynical narrative concocted by these early enablers of what became known as the State Capture Project was that political power had effectively been outsourced to the Chapter 9 institutions, and that this needed to be reined back. It is easy to see why they needed to neutralize these institutions, which had become a painful thorn on the side of a rogue leadership and an impediment in their grab for more power. They exposed, to different degrees, of course, the rot in our system of governance. The propagandists in our ranks accused them of feeding an anti-majoritarian and anti-ANC narrative, and that could not be tolerated. And so party hacks, with blind loyalty to the ANC, were appointed to key positions in these bodies in an attempt to dull their organizational faculties. Predictably, reports detailing the crucial investigations undertaken by these institutions, often implicating politically well-connected actors, started to gather dust. But thankfully for us, some of those who were appointed turned out to be fiercely independent. We need look no further than the outstanding work of our former public protector, Ms. Thuli Madonsela, and more recently, the Auditor General, Mr. Thembekile Makwethu, who is doing invaluable work in exposing the extent of theft and mismanagement by the state and its organs. And their project didn't end there. They sought to muzzle Parliament. The plot to muzzle Parliament, whose oversight role is the lifeblood of our democracy. It is important here to acknowledge at the outset that the structural flaw that comes with our party-list proportional representation system is one of the biggest problems. The ANC has effectively abused this system to its own ends, consistently endorsing blatantly unethical conduct at odds not only with the Constitution, but oftentimes with its own policies. Simultaneously, though, as we look to correct this electoral system's shortcomings, we have to be aware that this is a system that also ensured that the range of robust and savvy opposition parties who have learned to use a space afforded to them in Parliament to devastating effect were brought about by the same system. They have been as unorthodox as they have been ruthless in laying bare the moral bankruptcy of the Zuma regime and the decay of the ANC. The combined resistance of the media, civil society, and the political opposition has prevented the total success of the Zuma regime and ANC project to dismantle the protections and the political frameworks proffered by the Constitution. But it has not succeeded in halting the creation of a security state, where there is growing concern that privacy is being invaded, conversations tapped, and safety threatened for those actively trying to undermine the toxic status quo. It is a culture reminiscent of the apartheid era, one that Bram Fischer would have recognized and fought against tooth and nail. And so, what of state capture? A president, assured of protections afforded by co-opted institutions, embarked on a looting spree that runs parallel to the activities intended to undermine state institutions. Clearly, like termites gnawing at the base of a tree, this project of state capture has destabilized the country immensely, and so it has its economy, but importantly, its sovereignty. Our search for sustainable answers to reverse racially skewed ownership patterns and income inequality has been discredited, as these policies have been repeatedly exploited to pursue corrupt ends. With his erstwhile financier Shabir Sheikh jailed in 2007, Zuma had to build a new patronage network to feed his voracious appetite for money and finer things for himself, his family, and his cronies. We South Africans are not Pityana's. We have experienced all manner of thievery, evil, and corruption. And yet, we are collectively open-mouthed as the scale of theft and chiseling that is being revealed, and the relationship between Zuma and the Gupta family is laid bare each day by our media. State capture is no longer an obscure, abstract social science concept. It has been brought to life in terrifying detail. For the uninitiated, state capture is a phenomenon where an unelected group of people usurp executive power of a nation, directing policy, misdirecting resources, and sometimes dictating the conduct of state organs. In the South African context, at least one family and possibly other business interests have wielded this power over the president of our country, his family, and the inner circle of loyalists in exchange for monetary gain and sway over the government of our country. It is chronicled by our local and international media, and so I do not intend to dwell too much on it. Suffice to say that prospective cabinet ministers have been evaluated and then deployed in their new roles by the Gupta family. Not being the most discreet bunch, these shoe salesmen turned captors of our state appear to have gossiped about their decisions, even before affording their captured president the courtesy of making them public in his biannual cabinet reshuffles, as you will have come to know now. In the same vein, when incumbent ministers or officials fail to deliver to Gupta expectations, the family does the firing. The announcement from the president just becomes a formality. The Guptas realize the importance of ensuring that pliable people are placed in portfolios and posts in the state system to ensure that spigots are opened ever and ever wider, diverting the flood of state resources away from the many and into the coffers of the very few. A typical example, which is very topical in our news media today, is our state-owned corporations, where major decisions, principally around procurement, are ultimately decided between the captured ministers, directors, and senior executives who are connected to the Gupta family. And consequently, untold billions of dollars intended for critically needed infrastructure development, education, and job creation are being misdirected and siphoned off to local players and sophisticated international networks. The same template is being applied across a swathe of key ministries and parastatals. The evidence is splashed daily over the front pages of our newspapers and websites, and it is in the pages of the former Public Protector's report on state capture. Whistleblowers are leaking evidence, unsurprisingly, that goes to the prosecuting authorities, where it gathers dust. I'm sure by now you have a clear picture of what this is about. This criminal network has not limited itself to hard industry. They've also seen the opportunity presented by the programs intended to alleviate the vast challenges of absolute poverty, where the government spends over $12 billion annually on social grounds. By the way, close to 60% of government spending in some way or the other is directed at this social wage. About 17 million of our compatriots rely on these social grants as their sole means of survival. It is our national shame that there is no better opportunity for so many people in a country as wealthy as ours. But even this grant system has been used as a source of feasting by greedy politicians and their handlers. It is a clear, disgusting assault on government's constitutional mandate to uphold citizens' rights to human dignity. Right now, as I speak, hearings are underway in Jonesburg to uncover the truth behind the Life as a Demeni travesty, the clearest reminder yet that greedy politicians have turned their backs on the people. Over a number of months, the Gauteng provincial government pulled mentally ill patients from professionally run institutions and placed them in unregistered fly-by-night facilities. Politicians and government officials allegedly took kickbacks along the way. By the time the jig was up, all the rent seekers taking their money away with them, more than 140 mentally ill people had died, sickening and humiliating deaths because of greed and corruption. And so the rot runs deep, and I can go on and on. The thieves have gone about their work safe in the knowledge that the critical institutions that should hold public representatives to account have been hollowed out. With the president of the ANC in their pocket, their effective control of both the ruling party and government was sealed. It turns out that they were not wrong despite the denials from the ANC. But I can tell you that they are not sleeping easy at night any longer. South Africans, including loyal ANC voters, have realized with great resentment and anger that the power has been handed over to a criminal syndicate. The nation's sovereignty has been auctioned to a modest bidder. But ANC is in an intractable crisis. The ANC has seen its previously unassailable majority significantly eroded. But it is not the only one paying a heavy price for its moral bankruptcy. So too are its alliance partners in the South African Communist Party and the Congress of South African Trade Unions, who must take some responsibility for where things have gotten to. The ANC's elective conference in December will be a watershed moment for the country. This is so whether the figurative suicide bombers inside the ANC disrupt the conference or try to stop it from happening, the very fact that there is uncertainty over whether this political set piece will even be held is revealing of the depth of the structural crisis that the ruling alliance is finding itself today. And yet, our leadership keeps its head firmly buried in the sand with regard to the scale of the problems that are facing both the country and the ANC. Not even the office of the Secretary General of the ANC today can unequivocally give you a firm indication of the status of membership of the branches of the ANC. The fact is, membership lists in the ANC are in tatters. The contestations of credentials of participants at every conference of significance has become commonplace. The fact that ghost members are running ghost branches of the ANC is perhaps opposite for what increasingly looks like a zombie political party. Delegates are known to pay their way or be paid to attend decision-making events. And so our courts, which remain the bastion of probity and impartiality in our country, are increasingly dragged into the fracas to resolve the internal party disputes. On other occasions, of course, ANC members resort to violent physical confrontation, as we saw in the Eastern Cape recently at its provincial conference, where they hurled furniture across a hall at each other, providing yet another fitting metaphor for a political party that is systematically destroying itself. There's a very, very strong perception among South Africans that the ANC has become little more than a vehicle for thieves and looters, with only those who have self-interest at heart. They have truly captured the organization and left many of its tried and tested cadres, once proud revolutionaries, as nothing but hard-ringing lobby of whingers on the margins. These thieves are nothing if not single-minded in their purpose. They believe that holding positions in the ANC is worthwhile only because of the proximity it provides to government resources and to private businesses linked to state projects. They try to extort money in ANC's name from businesses desperate to secure contracts from government. In this regard, the ANC name is used and abused without let or hindrance, in which we grew up as a people. The ANC of today is not indeed the ANC that I know. It certainly is not the ANC that Bram Fischer knew. It is a very different ANC. And so we must ask the question, as the ANC conference comes up in December, is this a party that is capable of correcting itself? Is this a party that can retrace its steps? Is this a party that can rediscover itself? I can only give you my opinion, and it is that I doubt it very much. In times of such intractable crises, the ANC would ordinarily convene a consultative conference where leadership affords itself counsel from its cadres, its loyal cadres, and supporters and strategic friends in an unthreatening environment to talk about the problems. But Zuma's leadership has emphatically rejected calls from its own heroes and veterans for such an assembly, choosing instead to ridicule their attempt to return the movement to historically progressive and democratic values. They have chosen to harass and hound those who try to return the ANC to the right path. They employ their own goon squads in the form of increasingly unrecognizable ANC Youth and Women's League, and of course the so-called MK Military Veterans Association, an increasingly thuggish group of brown-shirt vigilantes. Many see the December elective conference of the ANC as a final throw of the dice for that organization. Many presume that this may be a moment to retrace and help ANC find its progressive democratic vision that inspired so many of us. A word of caution, however, we should not be surprised of the possibility that this may very well be a gathering of powerful interest external to the ANC itself. Interest that may very well be agnostic to the preservation of the ANC, or even more importantly, the survival of South Africa's democratic project. For these forces, a successful consultative conference would not serve their agenda. In the same vein, calls for the ANC leadership to fall on their sword following the 2016 dismal performance at local government elections were summarily rejected. Nonetheless, that conference will be a crucial moment for South Africa's democracy. Many of our true compatriots believe that an emphatic rejection of Zuma and his clique and the elevation to office of a candidate that embraces good governance and probity could spark the beginning of a political turnaround, which in turn could trigger an economic resurgence. Equally, however, there is a risk, and this is a real risk, that Zuma's faction could consolidate power. They are not going down without a fight. And this week's impulsive cabinet reshuffle is a clear indication of that, if any was needed. Some have started pushing for the so-called third way, that supposedly opens a way for a spirit of compromise for the disparate parties to find each other. But judging from the nominations currently doing rounds, the NEC slates of the respective candidates, what will be coming out of the December conference is less than a revolution and more of an accommodation, bound to reproduce varying shades of the same leadership that has plunged this organization into its worst crisis since its history. By rejecting the previous calls for the resignation of the NEC and convening of a consultative conference, the ANC has instead chosen the path of a revolution from the top, a fight to the finish among factions, or a false truce built on an unprincipled unity pact that will perpetuate the life of the various divisive factions. Either way, the December conference will shape the outcome of the next elections in 2019 and chart the destiny of South Africa for years to come. However, I'm skeptical about it being a moment of introspection that will ultimately lead the ANC's rehabilitation. It is worth remembering that the ANC had to choose between the will of the people to have Zuma removed from being president of our country in a motion of no confidence on the 8th of August, and it chose Zuma. In my view, it failed the Bram Fischer moment. In this regard, is it unreasonable to ask the question, can state capture be defeated without sacrificing the ANC? Is holding on to the ANC a greater prize than our sovereignty and the hard-won right to self-determination? Is this our Bram Fischer moment? Already the Communist Party in South Africa has decided to go it alone at the next elections in 2019 if they have followed their decision. COSATU has issued increasingly full-throated calls for Zuma to step down. The ANC itself is a house divided. Shouldn't we accept, perhaps, that these differences are irreconcilable? I humbly submit that the Revolutionary Alliance is irretrievably broken down. And so, maybe this is the last moment to say, long live the Alliance. But I just want to share with you a thought that we have the benefit of a powerful countervailing force that has emerged in civil society. One of the hidden treasures of South Africa's constitutional order is its emphasis on transparency and accountability. The other is the diffusion of power to demand and extract those. We're a nation driven by values that are codified in our constitution. As a result, no government can rely on majority support to invoke a political prerogative and act outside of the framework of the Constitution. The Constitution, therefore, is the supreme law of our land and the basis and the only basis on which we can be governed as a nation. On the 2nd of November, we'll be celebrating the first anniversary of Save South Africa campaign, one of the most formidable forces against state captures. The campaign was a culmination of the various efforts by civil society formations to hold everyone to the vision of our nation and the Constitution. In an unprecedented collective effort, on 7 April 2017, this year, well over 100,000 citizens from different parts of our country, different races, different orientation, took to the streets in protest against state capture. This more muscular civil society response to a delinquent state, and oftentimes private sector too, started to emerge long before the Zuma years, I need to highlight. You will recall the emergence of the Treatment Action Campaign with the full support of that great hero of our struggle, Nelson Mandela, took to the streets and the courts and forced a somewhat obstinate ANC government to make medical treatment available to those who were suffering HIV and AIDS. A court challenge by a recently established Council for the Advancement of South African Constitution against Zuma's attempt to extend the term of office of Chief Justice that I referred to earlier on was another intervention. Hugh Glenister, a South African citizen, took on Jacob Zuma after he abolished he removed the scorpions. And as a result, civil society combined to ensure that the Hawks have much greater power of independence and carrying out their responsibility than their predecessor in the scorpions, all because of civil society intervention. Freedom under the law successfully challenged the appointments to the Hawks and to the Directorate of Prosecutions of people who were inappropriate in those roles. A government preoccupied with corruption, too preoccupied to attend issues of education, was forced by Section 27 to ensure that textbooks were supplied at schools. Equal Education, another NGO, ensured that government was forced to regulate norms and standards for equitable education for all. 17 million grants recipients in South Africa have the Black Sash to thank for receiving their grants today. For were it not for their court battle, probably that would be in trouble today because of corrupt activities in the Department of Social Development. It was a combined outcry of civil society formations, including churches, trade unions, communities, and public interest legal groups, who demanded that there must be a commission of inquiry into the Marikana massacre, which was indeed instituted and resulted in the in the dismissal of the Commissioner of Police. An illegitimate national road upgrading program, which was to be funded on a user charge arrangement, was stopped on its tracks by another civil society formation organization undoing tax abuse. I could go on and on about civil society interventions during this period, challenging some of the most gruesome and corrupt activities. They include Corruption Watch, they include the Right to Know campaign, the Funukwazi, etc., etc. In all these efforts, our vibrant constitutionalists in civil society have been aided by an independent media that has fiercely and fearlessly ensured that public is informed. Most of the scandals surrounding the Zuma administration were exposed by investigative journalists, sometimes risking their own lives. I'm pleased to say that Nigwe Pikicha, who is one of the great journalists in South Africa, is in the audience here as a student at Oxford. Good to see you. Now, but today, as I deliver this lecture, many of the investigative journalists I'm referring to are observing what we call in South Africa the Black Wednesday, the day in 1977 when a number of newspapers were banned and some of our most courageous journalists were arrested and banned. I'm sure there would be no difficulty drawing parallels between the evil that journalists reported about apartheid in those days and the growing menace that we are seeing in today's South Africa. These journalists are a national treasure and also a potent weapon in the arsenal we are forced to employ to defend our constitutional democracy. They toil alongside civil society, our independent judiciary, and many of our Chapter 9 institutions in holding our leaders to account. To counteract them, Zuma has desperately and destructively clung onto the country's public broadcaster, the South African Broadcasting Corporation, in an attempt to turn it into his propaganda tool. And so, is South Africa's constitutional democracy sustainable? In large measure, as a direct result of state capture project, civil society has truly been awakened to defend our democracy, to protest against excesses, and to remind our leaders that we're a nation that has experience with people's power, and we're prepared to use it when required to do so. We're making maximum use of the space provided by the Constitution and forcing accountability from people who prefer to hide in the shadows. What we are seeing in South Africa, what we've seen in the recent period, is people's power in action. And I can tell you that it is working. And we intend to build on this momentum. We are determined to strengthen it as a countervailing force of people's power and a formidable political center that those in power will only ignore at their own peril. And so, yes, the ANC's elective conference in December is important, but I dare say it is not our Waterloo. We will be there, stronger than ever before, whatever the outcome. Whosoever emerges victorious must know that we are demanding that those in leadership positions must govern with integrity and respect. We are demanding that a corrupt president must be removed, not just from leading the ANC, but also from leading the country, importantly. And that he must be removed with immediate effect. We are demanding the immediate removal of corrupt ministers and a comprehensive cleanup of corrupt government departments, state-owned companies, etc. We are demanding accountability, and we insist that those who are involved in wrongdoing must pay the price and spend time in jail. We have issued a set of minimum demands as Save South Africa, which enjoys a large amount of support from the wider community. And it includes that the Commission of Inquiry that has been recommended by the Public Protector must be instituted without delay. We demand the restoration of the credibility of the institutions of the criminal justice system that Zuma has destroyed. We demand public affirmation by all political parties of their commitment to the independence of the judiciary and the integrity of Chapter 9 institutions, as well as providing resources to these bodies. We demand appointment of credible leaders to key economic institutions, particularly in the finance ministry and others. We demand full investigation into corrupt activities and misgovernance in state-owned entities. And finally, we insist that Zuma and the Guptas must not be allowed to leave South Africa and that their passports must be revoked until they face the full might of the law. Once we have succeeded turfing the crooks out of office, we will embark on a massive campaign to rebuild government, rebuild public service, and revitalize the public sector. We will also put a leadership code in place to ring-fence all political and business leaders to ensure we never go down this path again. We'll have to fast-track the move towards transparency in political party funding, which is now underway in Parliament. Our electoral system will need to be reconsidered. Our constitutional democracy, therefore, is sustainable because those of us who firmly believe in its efficacy will not allow it to be trampled upon by anyone. Our resolve in this regard is well documented. And so let me conclude and say this, that the Bram Fischer movement calls upon its true and honest cadres to take a hard look around them at the December elective conference. And when they do so, they must accept that there may be many among them who are perpetuating this toxic status quo. They must also accept that there can never be a price too big to pay to isolate and ostracize those that are committed to the project of state capture from the ranks of the ANC. That is why we must all resist calls for unity at all costs, as it might come at a very high price, not only for the ANC, but also for the country. The ANC's unity has always been based on values and principles, not personalities. If we remember that it is more the country that we're about than the ANC, the minimum demands that we've alluded to above provide a basis to retrace our journey to a constitutional democracy. An ANC leadership that emerges from its conference embracing this agenda will find ready allies in civil society who will not only be armchair critics, but prepared to deploy their skills to ensure the success of the project. In the event that the forces of state capture cement their takeover of the ANC in December, which, by the way, is a realistic prospect, genuine cadres will have their personal Bram Fischer moment. Just like Bram Fischer, they must honor the truth, follow their conscience, and join the many in civil society who have been relentlessly waging war against these elements of darkness. A failure to do so will legitimate these forces and make them accomplices to the abominable crime of selling our sovereignty out. This may be a moment for the further realignment of the country's politics and the foundation of a genuine post-apartheid alliance. Either way, I must say this, that the balance of forces in our polity today is heavily against the forces of state capture, but indeed in favor of the affirmation of the constitutional order. As another fine sign of our motherland, Steve Biko once put it is better to die for an idea that will live than to live for an idea that will die. And so, Bram Fischer died for a truly liberated South Africa. None of us have a right to betray the sacrifices that he and many others made so that we be free. It is nothing less than our historic mission, and that is why we must do everything in our power, all of us, to ensure that South Africa's constitutional democracy is sustained. I thank you very much for the opportunity you afforded me today.
Thank you, Sipho, for that remarkable address and for saying things with courage that few people say out loud. Thank you for that. We do have an opportunity now for a Q&A session. So I think we've got some microphones. Julie has microphones around. So if you'd like to ask a question of Sipho, please just raise your hand and then stand up and say your name, please. We have a question up here, Julie.
Molweni. Mr. Pityana, thank you. My name is Joshua. I'm a Rhodes Scholar here, studying African Studies. I wanted to ask you what credibility there is in the argument against your organization, Save South Africa, and many civil society organizations that you represent, white monopoly capital and the interests of an entrenched elite. What is your rebuttal to those criticisms you receive? Thank you.
My name's Paul Trewheeler. Mr. Pityana, you made the mention that the electoral system needs to be reconsidered. I wonder if you could elaborate on that further. The situation is that no MP in South Africa, no provincial councillor, and only half of all municipal councillors are elected by name as individuals in constituencies. All the rest are elected on a slate. Now, would you like to elaborate on that issue? And if when we're talking about the reconsideration of the electoral system, the issue of electoral reform, the electoral task team in January 2003 reported by majority in favor of a 75% system of election of individuals in multi-member constituencies. And that is something to be considered. Thanks very much.
Well, I'll start with George's question. Save South Africa is, as I indicated, is a culmination of various civil society organizations, one of which was the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, and that's how I became a convener. In fact, that's an organization that was the prime mover of the establishment of this organization. But others include civil society organizations that would feel uncomfortable being associated with being white monopoly capital. This includes Section 27, Treatment Action Campaign, et cetera, et cetera. And indeed, they also include trade union formations. FEDUSA, for instance, was one of the active participants in Save South Africa. We have church formations that are involved. One of the things that was different about the mass movement around Save South Africa was that we managed to persuade business to be part of this effort, and we deliberately sought to engage every section of society. It was important to have business involved because as part of the fight against corruption, corruption is rife in business, and you need to have moral leadership in business and those that are prepared to be part of this journey, to be part of the wider society's effort in fighting corruption so that they know they're not alone in fighting it in the business community. So at issue in Save South Africa is to deal with the decay that we've seen here. So the organization is much broadly representative than that. I guess in a way, answering Paul's question about electoral representation, electoral system, one of the things that was quite revealing was the 8th of August vote of no confidence. Now, this vote of no confidence is a culmination of a range of public protests that had happened in South Africa. And they involved calls that a few of us were making, I guess, in 2016, which were subsequently joined by virtually every important sector of society, including the trade unions, Council of Churches, and if you looked at the broad representation of the people that are represented through these structures that were part of this, they cut across the whole spectrum of society, including opposition political parties, including various sections of ANC's own leadership in parliament, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at that, the picture that gives you is that we have a movement in this Save South Africa initiative that is reminiscent of your anti-apartheid movement, and that the ANC's under Zuma is a very isolated entity. You would have expected then that in Parliament that would translate into the votes that go with that. But it didn't, because our electoral system is a party list system. And contrary to the oath of office that MPs make when they are sworn in as members of Parliament, that they would honor the Constitution, ANC members of Parliament were put in a situation where they had to dishonor the Constitution and their oath of office. Otherwise, they could possibly lose their jobs, there would be other consequences, and their being in Parliament is dependent on their being good members in standing in the ANC. And so, members of Parliament, therefore, owe their allegiance to the party. Members of Parliament should be capable of ignoring the voice of ordinary citizens because of our electoral system. And I did caution that we must be careful, because proportional representation enables you to have smaller communities to be represented, and that was one of the considerations. But this electoral system was one of those transitional arrangements in our constitutional system. It was supposed to be relooked at to ensure that we take into account other systems. And indeed, there's been work that was done by Van Zyl Slabbert, one of the leading social scientists in South Africa, who led a commission into this, and his report has never been taken forward. So outside of that, there's considerations of how do we ensure that we have an electoral system that, whilst not losing the possibility of ensuring that minorities are represented and their voices heard, but also enable ordinary citizens to hold members of parliament to account. If we had that system, Zuma would not be in power today.
Thank you. John Battersby from the Canon Collins Educational Legal Assistance Trust and the Tutu Foundation, UK. Sipho, if I may. The question I want to ask is about the international dimension of the whole state capture Gupta affair. As you know, Bell Pottinger is no longer, as a result of their role in promoting racial conflict in South Africa. KPMG is severely disgraced and under all kinds of investigation, particularly in South Africa, but it's obviously going to affect the global brand. McKinsey is on a much larger scale being investigated and has already suspended members, senior executives, and it's the most senior executive actually in South Africa. And the SAP, the SAP, the largest software company in the world, German company, has also had to take action against some of its senior executives. This is all because they have been dealing with the Guptas and benefiting financially from their dealings. Today, in the House of Lords, 2 hours ago, Lord Hayne of Neath rose to ask the British government to launch an urgent investigation into money laundering, or should I say suspected money laundering. One has to cover it, they haven't been found guilty yet, by HSBC and Standard Chartered for having laundered billions, for being suspected of having laundered billions of rands, certainly hundreds of millions of pounds, 400 million, through their banks of Gupta money. And this all comes from a whistleblower. The ID numbers are all there. The bank accounts are all there. 12 members of the Gupta family are detailed. What do you have to say about the international dimension? It's not South Africa that is uniquely corrupt. The international financial system is deeply corrupt. And the 4 major auditing companies are part of that system. And ironically, they've been cleaned out by South Africa, which is a deeply corrupt country at the moment because of, as you say, state capture. Your thoughts, please. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Nigiwe Bigicha. But Sipho, when you opened, you spoke about how President Zuma has turned the ANC into something that is hostile to the Constitution, and you elaborated the extent to which independent institutions have been compromised, such as the National Prosecuting Authority. Of course, there are those which have redeemed themselves, like the Public Protector's Office. But given what we've seen with the NPA and others, to what extent can we be confident that an institution like the IEC will not be similarly compromised come 2019, given the pressures which the ANC is now under? And also, as a follow-up, I think, to John's question, the international dimension that we're seeing now, the Chancellor calling for this investigation, the FBI, I believe, is in South Africa at the moment. We are now a crime scene, as it were. What do you make, then, of us seeking African solutions to African problems when the ultimate accountability and the comeuppance is now only seemingly going to come with an international investigation into state capture? Thank you.
Well, we must find the best tools we can from anywhere in the world to resolve problems that are impacting negatively on our societies. Oh, by the way, this Kazakh did something very interesting, and I remember talking to, I see former High Commissioner Anne Grant here in the audience. She was High Commissioner to South Africa. Her successor and I were chatting because the ANC government had decided to receive al-Bashir from Sudan, the murderous president, and refused to meet its international obligation and arrest him. And because civil society forced, by court action, tried to force him to be arrested, he, by early hours of the morning, had disappeared from the country. And as a result, ANC then moved to try and pull out of an international statute that it was an international convention that was part of to do this. And we went to court and forced them to reverse that decision. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because in the early years, and I was part of government at that time, in the early years, we were quite deliberate and quite aware of the limitations that there are in the African systems and the challenges that we faced as a country. So whilst we embrace being part of the African agenda, we also needed to be realistic about the fact that the networks go beyond the African continent. And so as part of this, coming to your question, John, is that we are part of the international crime fighting system. And that's why one is dwelling into this issue about the collapse of our intelligence services and their standing in the international intelligence community, because it actually makes the country quite vulnerable, because you can't trust their integrity. But one of the things is that we are signatory to a range of international instruments that enable us to be part of the international efforts against crime. For a very interesting reason, the President has been resisting amendments to the Financial Intelligence Center Act, which locates us as part of the international system to look at movements of money through international systems, especially by people who are politically connected and others. And that's one of the reasons as we'll have seen in the reports that have come out, that we've been able to see how much deals are done in South Africa, but payback is actually transacted in international platforms. And this is the moment when we actually test the system. And we put in place those mechanisms to ensure that wherever they are, these thieves and looters have no place to hide. It is important that this project succeeds. It doesn't matter who is involved. And this is one of the vindication of the efficacy of actually involving business in this, because there is a big crusade in the business community that anybody who has been involved in any of this must go and report themselves to the law enforcement agencies. Once they are discovered, they get kicked out of the business associations and are ostracized. So it's important that both nationally and internationally we follow through on this. And I have a great, nothing but high regard for Lord Hayne, whom I've known for many, many years in our anti-apartheid years in this country. And I have no doubt that he would not make a move without being sure that there is a basis to make that intervention. And these institutions must be exposed, and we must use every moment to do so. I'm not suggesting that there is any evidence of wrongdoing, but to the extent that there is suspicion of it, it must be done. You must remember that one of the things that we tried to achieve in those early years, and I think President Thabo Mbeki in particular was one of the key drivers of this, getting African countries to be assisted to track down money that is being taken away from their countries and sent back to those countries. Because this is money that is intended, in fact, for poor people. And these international systems are supposed to assist us in that regard. There is no doubt that the state capture project in South Africa has international tentacles. It's not a small and minor project. These agencies are are all over the place. Now, with regard to our independent electoral system, I must say that we have a very credible independent electoral system as a country, and it has served us very well for many, many years. And it has a litany of leaders that have a source of great pride for South Africa. Having said that, in recent period, you will know that the previous chair of our Independent Electoral Commission left under very unsavory circumstances, and that shows how jealously South Africans are guarding the independence of that institution. So I would hope that they would remain independent. There are concerns, though, that the new chairperson of the Independent Electoral Commission may not be sufficiently independent because he previously was serving as an advisor to the president in his previous role. And there are concerns about some of the changes that are proposed, which may be for the good, but not the kind of changes that you want to introduce when you're going to have the most contested elections in 2019 around the digital electronic system that is being used to administer elections. You don't want to pilot that in an election that is that's going to be highly contested in 2019. So we remain concerned about that. We also remain concerned about some of the issues that are being raised about certain developments in the IEC. So everybody is anxious that the IEC's independence and standing, particularly as we go to 2019, should not be undermined. Might there be foreign interests? Some people say there might be foreign interests that would have us see something not too dissimilar to what the Americans are complaining about there, because similar interests have interest in South Africa. So we are concerned about the independence of the electoral system, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So last year, when we were having dinner together, we noted that we had some representatives of the Rhodes scholarships who'd fought for freedom and national independence movements on our walls, including Norman Manley from Jamaica and Lucy Banda from Zambia. But we did notice that we didn't have any representatives other than Nelson Mandela himself from South Africa. And with the incredible generosity of Joel Joffe and Vanetta Joffe, Lady Joffe, we have a little treat for today. So I wonder if I can ask you to come up and help us.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming. I'll just give you a little brief background about the portrait. David Maiden, who is a friend of ours, asked if he could paint a portrait of Joel. And I think those of you who knew Joel would realize that sitting still for more than 2 minutes was an impossibility. So Joel did agree finally under pressure, and David painted a lovely portrait of him from photographs. Now David is based a lot in Kenya, and most of the portraits and animal portraits that he does are either from life or from his own photographs. So when we asked him if he would do this portrait, it was a huge challenge. He had to paint a portrait of a man he'd never met, who was deceased, who was greatly revered everywhere. He had to use mainly black and white photographs, footage from cine films, and with the help and support of Ilse and Ruth, and indeed anybody who knew Bram at all, he managed to put together a picture for a painting which encapsulated Brahms' personality, his complexion, and his humor. And I'll just finally say that although Brawn was a hero of Joel's, it was a little bit of a mutual admiration society. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's my job at the end of these wonderful lectures to say a few thank yous. So thank you today to the Warden and to Rhodes House. As ever, we couldn't do this without them. A special thank you to Julie and the Rhodes House team. They do an incredible amount of work behind the scenes, and without them this lecture simply wouldn't happen, and maybe we could have a round of applause for them. Thank you to Vanetta for being here. It's wonderful to have you here on this very important day for us. And we're going to end with a little tribute from the committee that organizes the lecture to Joel, who was a very good friend of ours and who was seminal in this lecture. He did a lot of work, as well as being enthusiastic, as well as being a supporter, as well as bringing his good humor, as well as always being here and welcoming people and making them feel like it was their home. He actually did a phenomenal amount of work behind the scenes as well. And in honor of that, and in honor of the other things that we're trying to do in promoting the ideas around the lecture, next year we will be launching an essay contest named in honor of both Joel and of Bram Fischer that we'll be using to get school kids both here in Oxford and in South Africa to write essays for a contest about Bram Fischer and Joel and moral courage that we will then have a little committee that will sit and decide the best of those, and there'll be a prize, and the people who write those essays will be invited to attend lectures, both this lecture and its counterpart in the South African context. And we hope that that will be a way of just further keeping alive the memory and the ideas of what these people have done and what they've meant for us. So now I'm going to pass over to Yvonne Milan. Yvonne is somebody who was instrumental in setting up this lecture, or resetting up this lecture 10 years ago. And like me, she's worked on every lecture since, along with Joel, and she's going to give a short tribute to Joel from the committee of the Bram Fischer Lecture in the UK. Thank you very much.
Joel was part of South Africa's greatest generation, the Rivonia generation. People who stood fearlessly against injustice, not for personal gain or fame, but for the most basic of moral obligations, to do what is right because it is right. Their courage reflected their character. It was the consequence of their humanity, and their courage made the future possible. True moral courage is not an impulsive act. It is deliberate and sustained. It is a choice. It is a course that is kept despite the odds. It has been said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but that it bends toward justice. Perhaps. But if it does, it's not the result of natural momentum or preordained destiny. It does not just happen. It happens because of people like Bram Fischer and Joel Joffe. We know the meaning of moral courage because of people like Bram and Joel. They stood up for justice when the consequences could be fatal. So however dark and dangerous the world becomes, we cannot say that there were not those who did have the courage to spark a light and to lead the way. The many always benefit from the courage of the few, and we, the beneficiaries of their courage, should do much, much more to emulate people like Joel and Brawn, to live lives worthy of such courage and sacrifice. It is the most fitting way to honor their lives and legacy. We also received the following message from Justice Edmund Cameron, who delivered this lecture in 2015. He writes, Joel Joffe's death, though a profoundly sad moment, cast a vivid light on the generosity of his life. As he lay dying, he wrote a note to us all, one dignified and typical. He was thinking of those thinking of him, wanting to continue doing things useful for others, determined to express gratitude and happiness. That he expressed himself content for his life to end in the state in which he was itself an act of rare moral wisdom and self-command. To me, it was as inspiring as Joel's life was. Joel's deep wells of generosity as a human being, as a benefactor, as a friend, as a mentor, as a moral voice, will continue to flow richly across our lives, and his memory will live across many continents in his lavish acts of human kindness. Lastly, a message from Ruth Rice and Ilse Wilson, Bram Fischer's daughters, who took part in last year's lecture. As we think of Joel, we are overwhelmed with memories. Memories full of admiration, gratitude, and of our love. We remember him for his many kindnesses, for his generosity and warmth. We remember him for his unwavering commitment to others, for his integrity, and for his bravery. He did not hesitate to take on the unpopular case of the Ravonia trial at a time when no other attorneys were willing to take the risk. We especially remember the remarkable relationship between Bram and Joel. They had extraordinary respect for and admiration for each other, and indeed, a profound love for one another. Joel did much to keep the memory of Bram as a struggle hero alive. In practical terms, he supported the first biography of Bram, the Bram Fischer lectures at the Legal Resources Centre in Johannesburg, and the lecture in Oxford. The portrait that was unveiled today was his brainchild. Joel's contribution to making the world a better place is a testimony to his life. Thank you.
And just a very final word, ladies and gentlemen. As you know, at this lecture, we support the Alliance for Lawyers, the PBI, and we support the Alliance for Lawyers Support Human Rights. Suzy Baskin is here again, as usual, and we have information about that charity outside. It's a charity that was very important to Joel. They work to protect human rights activists and lawyers working around the world in conditions that are extremely dangerous, who are in fear of their lives. And every year, they save the lives of tens of human rights lawyers. So you will find their information outside. You will also find the information on the sheet in front of you. If you can, please do give to them and help continue the work that people like Joel and others have been doing over the last 10 years. It's important as we sit here and we hear fantastic talks like we did today from our wonderful speaker, to remember that there are so many countries, especially in Africa, where it is still incredibly dangerous to be a lawyer. Thank you very much.
Well, I guess I get the end of the end. Thanks everyone for being here today. It's always a really special time for us. We give huge thanks to our speaker, Sipho Pityana. Lady Joffe, it's such a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you to Camilla for working with the artist to produce this remarkable portrait. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Yvonne, for your words about Joel. So thanks everybody, and we'll see you next year.